Hello everyone. So I have another game here today. I'm playing as Black against Sud 44. The reason why I wanted to show this game was that I think honestly my opponent outplayed me until the end game. The other two uploads I've had on this channel, the games were of quite low standard. This one I think I had an accuracy, um, without spoiling the end, 87%. To my opponent's 78%. But for most of the game, really, I was struggling to keep up. My opponent played a very good game. But the principle, I guess, or what I would take out of this game was um, essentially just trying to create an advantage. Um, I don't know if it was Morphe or someone else, but there's this famous quote about essentially just taking, like seizing the opportunity, I guess, and creating an attack from seemingly nothing. But by playing proactive chess, you can essentially um, try and um, put the game into your favor. Well, I didn't know I could edit that. All right, so the opponent opens knights to f3. I just like to take control of the center. That's pretty much all my opening knowledge at this point. They developed both knights. I captured the center. That was seen as the best move. I might just remove that for now, and at the end I'll have a look at it. Um, yep, so he plays pawn to e3, just controlling those two center squares. I developed my bishop. There's essentially an attack on his queen here. My thought process was if I can eliminate this knight, essentially I can push my pawn up to the center of the board and have more mid control. Usually bishops are seen as more important than knights, but in my mind that was a solid trade-off. So he develops his bishop, so his queen's no longer in trouble if he moves his knight. I trade for his knight. So seemingly I lost some advantage, but it's quite early on, so trade. Now he's attacking this center pawn twice, but I've already calculated my knight here as well as my queen defends it twice. I do develop c6. I think that was probably an incorrect move. I think I probably should have pushed e5 maybe, get more control over the center. Am I able to highlight them? No. But instead I played c6. He castles. Now I take control of the center. He essentially creates a pretty strong wall of defense there. However, it is in his half. I hope that at this point I could develop my pieces a little bit better or more efficiently. Um, However, the advantage is still really on his side. I guess he has already castled. I still need a castle, and ultimately this isn't actually an advantage at all. It's pretty even. So I developed my bishop. He pushes his pawn forwards, basically limiting the movements of my bishop. I decide to castle, pushes his pawn forwards even more. That puts me in the advantage. So he goes from plus 3-6 to -4. So he lost essentially 0.8 points there, which is not substantial, but it's quite large. I'm not too sure why. It seems quite good. I can't move my bishop out. Um, I decide to challenge his pawn. He pushes a pawn forwards. I take it. That was the incorrect thing to do, so essentially I just give his knight a free square. There's no pawn on this or this square to push and challenge for knights. And it's also attacking my centralized bishop, and I quite like having my bishop centralized. Yeah, so I lost the advantage there. Perhaps what I could have played in hindsight was maybe just leave that piece there. Essentially, I like this pawn being there because it helps back up this pawn, and it does essentially anti his knight to some degree. But by taking this pawn here, I actually make my center weaker. So perhaps that's something I could develop in the future. But for now, I took his pawn. I'm now -1. So essentially, yeah, -0.3 to +1. So essentially, it was quite a bad move. He takes it with his knight. How do I react to that? I push my pawn forward. I'm not too sure what the logic was here. It's being covered twice. I think I'd like to move my rook across to the e file, maybe create an opening. I think it was just a prophylactic move because this pawn's no longer being covered. I was worried he would come up and challenge it, maybe push that, maybe do something like that. I would perhaps take it or move it forwards. Either way, it looks like I could be down a trade quite easily. So I try and take the advantage. The artificial intelligence says that's a pretty even thing to do. He takes. I develop my bishop attacking his castle. I believe my intention is to take with a pawn. However, if I can also develop my bishop as well as taking my pawn back, then I think that's something better. He essentially reinforces his knight here, moves it away from my pawn. At this point, I do my queen trade. I move my knight up. The intention of this was that I wanted my rooks to be connected. He develops his bishop attacking my bishop because this bishop's in a really good square. I decide to trade off bishops. And essentially, after all the trading, we're equal in pieces, and the difference +1 is quite negligible at this rank. I don't think people at this rank, at least maybe I'm just being too general here, but at this rank, +1 doesn't really matter as much as if it was a higher rank. It's quite difficult to know the precise moves to capitalize on it. He moves his knight there. It's a pretty aggressive spot, even though it's not really attacking anything. It's not really a comfortable position for the knight to be in for me. So I'm swing my knight across here to trade off knights with him. The intention being that if he left his knight there, I could take, and then for him to trade back, he would use his castle, then I'd be up a piece. So what does he do? Let me think. What if he traded knights like that, then I move my castle across? And that's not too bad of a position for me at all. Yeah, but essentially I forgot this whilst playing the game, but essentially my knight was covering that pawn. So by retreating my knight back to trade off with his knight, I essentially gave him a free pawn. At this point now, we're approaching end game, and he'll be up a passed pawn. Well, I'm not sure if it's quite a passed pawn, but seeing as his castle's attacking b7, it could very easily turn into a pass pawn. So I think that's why the advantage is in his favor. So yeah, essentially it wasn't a very good position from from my end of it. In the report, I believe this is nearing the top of his advantage. So really, I could have been in a pretty bad spot by having my knight moved away. Back to position. Yeah, essentially, if I'd moved my castle forward one position, I swung this castle around, I could have had a double file. And anyway, so he moves his knight. I take his castle with my castle. He takes my castle with his bishop. I move my knight back. Not a very good move, seeing as he can trade off material. Seeing as he's plus a pawn, the pawns become more important later in the game. As well as he just takes my other pawn. So now he's plus 2 pawns. I swing my castle across to attack his bishop. If some alternative reality he's got to move his bishop, it would actually be a checkmate, as it would be back rank checkmate, as he wouldn't be able to move his king anywhere because of the pawn wall. Yep, he moves his bishop out of the way. I put pressure onto his bishop, and I also am attacking this pawn here. This is a move that I had seen. It's a pretty well-known tactic, I believe, to put your castle onto their second rank to try and take as many pawns as they can. So it's a rather aggressive position. Here he gave me a big advantage by trying to cover his pawn with the bishop. Now, in hindsight, if I'd developed the knight, I could have put pressure on his bishop. And had there been pressure on his bishop, yeah, I'm not too sure. Actually, that goes over my head why that's a better move. Instead, I play my castle there. I'm not sure why it's such a mistake of a move, because it forces his bishop to be essentially out of commission. Being wedged in between the king, the bishop can't move. However, my rook can still do damage from this position, I believe. So I'm not too sure why that was a mistake. Now, this is pretty much where I decided to be more proactive. So I start swinging my knight around to essentially win that piece there. And I think that's the factor that essentially led to me winning, even though it's plus 4. So he plays that pawn, gives breathing room to his king. However, he should have started moving his castle to prevent this from happening. Had he seen in advance that I would be swinging my knight across and attacking his bishop that can't move, I think he would have played that move, but instead he didn't. Now it's too late to swing his rook to c7. He checks me. I move my king over. I saw that coming. He starts attacking my pawn. At this rate, I was happy to no longer cover my pawn because I would be winning a bishop. Now, essentially, he moves this pawn. I think he's just starting a pawn storm. However, I think that his priority should have been to get his king out of the way and, in essence, get his bishop out of the way. And that's why he should have moved the center pawn. Had he moved his center pawn, he could move his king out of the way and also cover his bishop as well, in case I did decide to prematurely trade the bishop with my castle before my knight had gotten there in time. Alas, he didn't. Now this is the position where I started having advantage for the first time in the game. He pushed the wrong pawn forwards again. However, I'm not too sure why this pawn would have been better. I took my knight. I put a lot of thought into this. I should have taken with the castle. Taking with my knight, it's quite difficult to get my knight out of there. As you can see, he played the best move. He put his king there. So now my retreating square is gone. Had I moved here, it's a huge blunder because then he can move his king and win one of my pieces back. So at this rate, that was probably why I should have actually taken. I should have taken his bishop with my castle instead of the knight. So I played cat and mouse a bit with his king. I was actually happy with threefold repetition at this point. As you can tell, we're about to approach a late game, and I have 2 minutes left, and he has 5 minutes 30. So instead of deciding to draw, he decided he could win the game by leaving his king there. I check him. In my mind, I had a bit of a sequence. He still could have won my knight, actually, in hindsight. But by moving his king there, it allows my knight to retreat. I start taking his pawn, as well as giving a square for my knight. Move my castle further out of range, and also start attacking his pawn. Now, I had hoped he would actually try and protect his pawn, because there's a fork, which is pretty decent. So it's forking his king and his castle. He moved his king out of check. I take his castle. So at this point, I've converted a losing position, where I was losing 2 pawns in an endgame, to a +6 position, where I had taken one of his pawns, his castle, and his bishop. So that's the importance of being proactive, I guess, rather than defensive, even if you are in a losing position. So he starts moving his pawns. I take this pawn. He pushes that pawn forwards. I wanted to get behind his pawns. And go for g2. He moves g2 forwards. I move my castle to g2 still. Pushes that pawn forwards. I move my knight forwards. Essentially just putting more pressure on his pawns. And if he goes to one particular pawn to cover it, then the intention was to take the other pawn. So he moves his king. I move my king. I want to start to wedge my king and block the squares he has to move to. So he pushes that forwards. I was actually thinking of moving my king forwards. I probably should have further block his ability to actually get his king around to attack my pawns. But I move my castle there. He pushes his pawn forwards to trade pawns. He succeeds. Rather than moving my pawn up, I don't know why I would do that, but I decided to move my king upwards to start eliminating his pawns. In my mind, as long as I eliminate his pawns, then there's not much of a threat. There's only a minute left on the clock for me, so I start moving quite quickly. I start moving my knight over. Pushes the pawn forwards to cover it from the knight. I move my castle up. At this point, it's just really trading down pawns and ensuring that I have an advantage. And yeah, at this point, I just start moving my pawn forwards. I keep my castle here to cover this line as well as this line. How did he move towards my castle? I would just retreat my castle down here and create a line of defense whilst this pawn becomes the queen. So yeah, I just slowly queen the pawn. I'm not sure why I moved my knight there. It says the best move. I'm not too sure why. Yeah, so I queen my pawn, and now it's the oldest checkmate in history. I just slowly shift my queen and my castle around. I decided to go with that tactic instead of trying to checkmate with a castle and a king, because this seemed like a simpler thing to do. Yeah, so thanks for watching my video, and hopefully there are more to come.